Good afternoon. Welcome to this much anticipated event, a debate and discussion with Christopher Hitchens and Alister McGrath on the topic, Poison or Cure? Religious Belief in the Modern World. My name is Tom Banchoff. I'm director of the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown, and the co-convener of this event, along with the Ethics and Public Policy Center. The Berkeley Center is part of a university-wide effort to make Georgetown a global leader in the interdisciplinary study of religion and in the promotion of interreligious understanding. This effort builds off our academic strengths, our location here in Washington, D.C., our international networks, and Georgetown's Catholic and Jesuit identity, an identity that embraces dialogue with other faith traditions and with the wider secular world. What brings us together today is, of course, religious-secular debate or dialogue. From one perspective, a kind of intellectual combat. From another perspective, a shared quest for truth, marked by a willingness on both sides to ask and to attempt to answer very big questions. And I can think of no question bigger than the one on your program today. I anticipate an engaging conversation, and I have a sneaking suspicion it will be entertaining as well. We have a lot to look forward to, and with that I would like to turn it over to Michael Cromarty, Vice President of the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and the real driver behind tonight's event. Michael, thank you for bringing us together. I know we all look forward to a stimulating conversation.
Thank you, Tom. I'd like to begin by saying thank you to President DeGioia of this wonderful university for allowing us to have this event in this beautiful setting in Gaston Hall. I'm also grateful to Tom and his staff for all their help and work in making this event possible and to co-host it with the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Now, on the back page of your program, you'll see the names of some individuals and some foundations who helped make this event possible. We, of course, are very grateful for their generous support. I'd like to say a few words also about our format. Mr. Hitchens will go first for 15 or 20 minutes, and then be followed by Professor McGrath, who will then have the same amount of time. Then Mr. Hitchens will then have 8 to 10 minutes for rebuttal, and then he'll be followed by Professor McGrath for 8 or 10 minutes. The rebuttals will occur, their presentations will occur from here. The rebuttals will occur from the seats. That way I can moderate. We'll then open it up to questions from the audience, and the way we're going to do that is the following. I believe all of you have been given, I hope, 3x5 cards to write your questions on. They'll be collected by the ushers, and then I will read the questions. Now, there are almost 800 people here. I don't think we'll get to all 800, but we will get to, I hope, a significant amount of them. Now, I would not take time just now to give an extensive introduction of our speakers, because you have in your brochure elaborate biographies of each of these gentlemen. And of course, I know you're here because you know their reputations, and that's why you've come. So I would like to begin my introduction with Christopher Hitchens this way, by calling your attention to this cartoon. In an issue this past June, the New Yorker magazine ran the following cartoon. I'll describe it to you. The wife is sitting on the couch, reading. The husband is walking in the door, and just as he's coming in the front door, a bolt of lightning is striking him right in the back. And the wife says, "I begged you not to buy that book by Christopher Hitchens." Ladies and gentlemen, he bought the book, and so have many others. Christopher's book, God Is Not Great, has been on the New York Times bestseller list now for, I think, over 20 weeks. In introducing Christopher Hitchens, I should at least mention what some others have said about him and his gifts. Here's the London Observer, who has said, he is one of the most prolific as well as brilliant journalists of our time. Or the Los Angeles Times has said this, he is a political and literary journalist extraordinaire. And the New Yorker magazine has said, He is an intellectual willing to show his teeth in the cause of righteousness. And finally, Christopher, you would be interested to know that our mutual friend, the political philosopher Peter Berkowitz, who's here tonight, recently said this about you. Whether you agree or disagree with what he says or writes, Christopher is utterly incapable of ever being boring. Christopher, thank you for coming. We trust you will not be boring.
Well, thank you, Georgetown. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. Thank you, Michael, for that suspiciously terse introduction, which of all the introductions I've heard to myself is certainly the most recent. Thank you seriously to the Ethics and Public Policy Center for your work, for conceiving this idea, for encouraging me to do it, for bringing us Dr. McGrath all the way from our common alma mater of Oxford, and for the regular seminars that you may not know that Michael does all the time on these matters of faith versus reason, which is after all the ground on which we're met this evening. I always come before events like this with antagonists like Dr. McGrath with a slight sense, a very slight sense, hope it doesn't sound self-pitying, of inequality. My views are, if I say it for myself, tolerably well advertised. And if they're not, it's partly your fault. Because what I say is fairly intelligible, very plainly stated. You know what I think if you care to find out. When I debate with Jews and Muslims and Christians, I very often find, I say, well, do you really believe there was a virgin birth? Do you really believe in a Genesis creation? Do you really believe in bodily resurrection? And I get a sort of Monty Python reply. Well, there's a little bit of metaphorical, really. I'm not sure, and I'm going to find out, I'm determined to find out this evening, which line on this my antagonist does take. And I want you to notice, and I want you to test him on it. Because I think it's fair. And I'm going to talk to him and to you as if he did represent the Christian faith. I can't do all three monotheisms tonight. I may get a whack at the other two in the course of the discussion. I can only really do his. And I'm going to assume that it means something to him and that it's not just a humanist metaphysics. And I think I'm entitled to that assumption. The main thing I want to dispute this evening, because I'm either drowning in time with 20 minutes, it's either too much or too little, is this. You hear it very often said by people of a vague faith that, well, it may not be the case that religion is metaphysically true. Its figures and its stories may be legendary or dwell on the edge of myth, prehistoric. Its truth claims may be laughable. We have better explanations for the origins both of our cosmos and our species now, so much better so, in fact, that had they been available to begin with, religion would never have taken root. No one would now go back to the stage when we didn't have any real philosophy. We only had mythology. When we thought we lived on a flat planet, or when we thought that our planet was circulated by the sun instead of the other way around, when we didn't know there were microorganisms as part of creation and that they were more powerful than us and had dominion over us rather than we them, when we were fearful, the infancy of our species, we wouldn't have taken up theism if we'd known now what we did then. But allow for all that. Allow for all that. You still have to credit religion with being the source of ethics and morals. Where would we get these from if it weren't for faith? I think if, in the time I've got, I think that's the position I most want to undermine. I don't believe that it's true that religion is moral or ethical. I certainly don't believe, of course, that any of its explanations about the origin of our species or the cosmos or its ultimate destiny are true either. In fact, I think most of these have been conclusively, utterly discredited. But I'll deal with the remaining claim. Is it moral? Again, I can only do Christianity this evening. Is it moral to believe that your sins, yours and mine, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, can be forgiven by the punishment of another person? Is it ethical to believe that? I would submit that the doctrine of vicarious redemption by human sacrifice is utterly immoral. I might, if I wished, if I knew any of you, you were my friends, or even if I didn't know you, but I just loved the idea of you. Compulsory love is another sickly element of Christianity, by the way. But suppose I could say, look, you're in debt, I've just made a lot of money out of a God-bashing book. I'll pay your debts for you. Maybe you'll pay me back someday, but for now I can get you out of trouble. I could say, if I really loved someone who'd been sentenced to prison, if I could find a way of saying I'd serve your sentence, I'd try and do it. I could do what Sidney Carton does in A Tale of Two Cities, if you like. I'm very unlikely to do this unless you've been incredibly sweet to me. I'll take your place on the scaffold. But I can't take away your responsibilities. I can't forgive what you did. I can't say you didn't do it. I can't make you washed clean. The name for that in primitive Middle Eastern society was scapegoating. You pile the sins of the tribe on a goat, you drive that goat into the desert to die of thirst and hunger, and you think you've taken away the sins of the tribe. A positively immoral doctrine that abolishes the concept of personal responsibility on which all ethics and all morality must depend. It has a further implication. I'm told that I have to have a share in this human sacrifice, even though it took place long before I was born. I had no say in it happening. I wasn't consulted about it. Had I been present, I would have been bound to do my best to stop the public torture and execution of an eccentric preacher. I would do the same even now. No, I'm implicated in it. I myself drove in the nails. I was present at Calvary. It confirms the original filthy sin in which I was conceived and born, the sin of Adam in Genesis. Again, this may sound a mad belief, but it is the Christian belief. Well, it's here that we find something very sinister about monotheism and about religious practice in general. It is incipiently, at least, and I think often explicitly, totalitarian. I have no say in this. I am born under a celestial dictatorship which I could not have had any hand in choosing. I don't put myself under its government. I am told that it can watch me while I sleep. I'm told that it can convict me of, here's the definition of totalitarianism, thought crime. For what I think, I may be convicted and condemned. And that if I commit a right action, it's only to evade this punishment. And if I commit a wrong action, I'm going to be caught up not just with punishment in life for what I've done, which often follows axiomatically, but even after I'm dead. In the Old Testament, gruesome as it is, recommending as it is of genocide, racism, tribalism, slavery, genital mutilation, and the displacement and destruction of others, terrible as the Old Testament gods are, they don't promise to punish the dead. There's no talk of torturing you after the earth has closed over the Amalekites. Only till when gentle Jesus, meek and mild, makes his appearance, are those who won't accept the message told they must depart into everlasting fire. Is this morality? Is this ethics? I submit, not only is it not only does it come with the false promise of vicarious redemption, but it is the origin of the totalitarian principle which has been such a burden and shame to our species for so long. I further think that it undermines us in our most essential integrity. It dissolves our obligation to live and witness in truth. Which of us would say that we would believe something because it might cheer us up, or tell our children that something was true because it might dry their eyes? Which of us indulges in wishful thinking, who really cares about the pursuit of truth at all costs and at all hazards? Can it not be said, do you not in fact hear it said repeatedly about religion and by the religious themselves that, well, it may not be really true, the stories may be fairy tales, the history may be dubious, but it provides consolation? Can anyone hear themselves saying this or have it said of them without some kind of embarrassment, without the concession that thinking here is directly wishful? That yes, it would be nice if you could throw your sins and your responsibilities on someone else and have them dissolved, but it's not true, and it's not morally sound. And that's the second ground of my indictment. Michael, you will tell me when I'm trespassing on the time of Dr. McGrath, won't you? On our integrity, our basic integrity, in knowing right from wrong and being able to choose the right action over a wrong one, I think one must repudiate the claim that one doesn't have this moral discrimination innately, that no, it must come only from the agency of a celestial dictatorship, which one must love and simultaneously fear. What is it like? I've never tried it. I've never been a cleric. What is it like to lie to children for a living and tell them that they have an authority that they must love, compulsory love, what a grotesque idea, and be terrified of at the same time? What's that like, I want to know? And that we don't have an innate sense of right and wrong. The children don't have an innate sense of fairness and decency, which of course they do. What is it like? I can personalize it to this extent. My mother's Jewish ancestors are told that until they got to Sinai, they'd been dragging themselves around the desert under the impression that adultery, murder, theft and perjury were all fine. They get to Mount Sinai only to be told it's not kosher after all. I'm sorry. Excuse me. We must have more self-respect than that for us, for ourselves and for others. Of course, the story is a fiction. It's a fabrication exposed conclusively by Israeli archaeology. Nothing of the sort ever took place, but suppose we take the metaphor. It's an insult. It's an insult to us. It's an insult to our deepest integrity. No, if we'd believed that perjury, murder and theft were all right, we wouldn't have got as far as the foot of Mount Sinai or anywhere else. Now we're told what we have to believe. And this is coming now to the question of whether or not science, reason and religion are compatible, or I would rather say reconcilable. The great Stephen Jay Gould, the late great Stephen Jay Gould, said that he believed they were non-overlapping magisteria. You can be both a believer and a person of faith. Sitting in front of me is a very distinguished, extremely distinguished scholar, Francis Collins, helped us to unlock the Human Genome Project, who is himself a believer. I'd love to hear from him. I hope we will hear from him. I don't believe he says that his discoveries in the genome convinced him of the truth of religion. He holds it, as it were, independently. I hope I do you no wrong, sir, in phrasing it like that. Here's why I, a non-scientist, will say that I think it's radically irreconcilable, I'd rather say, than incompatible. I've taken the best advice I can on how long Homo sapiens has been on the planet. Carl Sagan, Richard Dawkins, many others, and many discrepant views from theirs, reckon it's not more than 250,000 years, quarter of a million years. It's not less either. I think it's roughly accepted. I think, sir, you wouldn't disagree. 100,000 is the lowest I've heard. And actually, I was about to say, again, not to sound too Jewish, I'll take 100,000. I only need 100,000. Call it 100. For 100,000 years, Homo sapiens was born, usually, not usually, very often, dying in the process or killing its mother in the process. Life expectancy probably not much more than 20, 25 years. Dying probably of the teeth after that, very agonizingly, near to the brain as they are, or of hunger, or of microorganisms that they didn't know existed, or of events such as volcanic or tsunami or earthquake types that would have been wholly terrifying and mysterious, as well as some turf wars over women, land, property, food, other matters. You can fill in, imagine it for yourself, what the first few tens of thousands of years were like. And we like to think, learning a little bit in the process, and certainly having gods all the way, worshipping bears fairly early on, I can sort of see why. Sometimes worshipping other human beings, big mistake. I'm coming back to that if I have time. This and that and the other thing. But exponentially perhaps improving, though in some areas of the world very nearly completely dying out. And a bitter struggle all along. Call it 100,000 years. According to the Christian faith, heaven watches this with folded arms for 98,000 years and then decides it's time to intervene. And the best way of doing that would be a human sacrifice in primitive Palestine, where the news would take so long to spread that it still hasn't penetrated very large parts of the world. And that would be our redemption of the human species. Now, I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, That is what I've just said, which you must believe to believe the Christian revelation, is not possible to believe, as well as not decent to believe. Why is it not possible? Because a virgin birth is more likely than that. A resurrection is more likely than that. And because if it was true, it would have two further implications. It would have to mean that the designer of this plan was unbelievably lazy and inept, or unbelievably callous and cruel and indifferent and capricious. And that is the case with every argument for design and every argument for revelation and intervention that has ever been made. But it's now conclusively so because of the superior knowledge that we've won for ourselves by an endless struggle to assert our reason, our science, our humanity, our extension of knowledge against the priests, against the rabbis, against the mullahs who've always wanted us to consider ourselves as made from dust, or from a clot of blood, according to the Quran, or as the Jews are supposed to pray every morning, at least not female or Gentile. And here's my final point, because I think it's coming to it. The final insult that religion delivers to us, the final poison it injects into our system. It appeals both to our meanness, our self-centeredness, and our solipsism, and to our masochism. In other words, it's sadomasochistic. I'll put it like this. You're a clot of blood, you're a piece of mud, you're lucky to be alive. God fashioned you for his convenience, even though you're born in filth and sin. And even though every religion there's ever been is distinguished principally by the idea that we should be disgusted by our own sexuality. Name me a religion that does not play upon that fact. So you're lucky to be here, originally sinful and covered in shame and filth as you are. You're a wretched creature. But take heart. The universe is designed with you in mind. And heaven has a plan for you. Ladies and gentlemen, I close by saying, I can't believe there is a thinking person here who does not realize that our species would begin to grow to something like its full height if it left this childishness behind, if it emancipated itself from this sinister, childish nonsense. And I now commit you to the good Dr. McGrath. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. Well, besides what you can read in his bio in your program, I should let you know that Professor McGrath holds two Oxford doctorates, one a Doctor of Divinity for his work on historical theology and systematic theology, and another Doctorate of Philosophy for his work on molecular biophysics. Here's what Publishers Weekly said recently about his work. Dr. McGrath has distinguished himself as a historical theologian and as a generous and witty writer who brings to life topics that would turn to dust in others' hands. We're especially grateful that Professor McGrath has traveled all the way from Oxford last night to join us for this evening. Thank you, Dr. McGrath.
Well, thank you very much indeed. It's a huge pleasure to be here at Georgetown this afternoon. Now, if someone had told me when I was growing up that I'd be here at such a distinguished place as Georgetown talking about atheism, I'd have been extremely surprised. I think for two reasons. One was I grew up in Northern Ireland. Now, some of you may come from this place, but it's a kind of rather backward place. And the greatest annual event of my youth was the Donaghadee Donkey Derby. So you can see, coming to somewhere like Washington was just amazing. So, it's great to be here. But I think what would surprise me more would have been if someone were to say, well, you're taking part in a debate about atheism, is I would have assumed that I would have been on the atheist side. Because certainly, as a young man, that was what I believed. I grew up in Northern Ireland, studying the sciences, wanting to go to Oxford to take this further, and it was very, very clear to me that the sciences disprove God, they completely eroded the ground on which faith stood, and of course there was violence between Protestant and Catholic in Northern Ireland. Therefore, my logic was infallible. No Catholics, no Protestants, no violence between Catholics and Protestants. So it seemed to me to be very, very straightforward. And certainly, when I went up to Oxford to begin to study the sciences in much more detail, it seemed to me, really, I had sorted things out and could relax for a while. But I found myself being challenged by a number of things. One was being challenged by beginning to read the history and philosophy of science and reading that the kind of scientific positivism I'd imbibed wasn't quite as straightforward as I'd suggested. And also beginning to realize, actually, that the evidential basis for atheism was much weaker than I had realized. And I began to find myself being excited intellectually and stimulated far more than I dared to think by the Christian faith. And so in the end, I came to faith, swapping my old faith of atheism for my new one of Christianity. I don't think I did so as any kind of wish fulfillment or of any kind of psychological need. It was much more just a profound intellectual conviction that this was right, that this made sense in itself, and that this made sense of things as well. It was like someone, I suppose, who knew water discovering champagne. So for me, this was really a very significant event. And indeed, to this day, I still look back at my atheist days with great nostalgia, even though I no longer actually hold to those positions. And so it's a very great pleasure to be able to interact this afternoon with Christopher Hitchens. And I want to make it very, very clear that what he is saying today needs to be respected, and I hope I will behave respectfully towards him. I want to offer some points of disagreement, some points of challenge, some points of agreement, and also some genuine points of curiosity to try and get our conversation underway. And so I want to really focus on his main argument, which I think you've heard very, very clearly, that religion is immoral and leads to immorality, that in some way it is toxic. And these seem to me to be very significant arguments, very significant claims, and therefore I want to try and engage with them. I apologize to him, and indeed I also apologize to you, in that in the time available I will not be able to interact with him properly, but at least I hope I can begin to get this conversation moving forward. So an obvious question I found myself asking as I both read Mr. Hitchens' book and also listened to him speak, is that I think there are aspects of this that I'd have loved to have heard more about. For example, in recent years, especially the last 15 years, there's been a very substantial body of scientific research into the empirical effect that religious commitment actually has on people. And as someone who was a scientist and still remains wedded to evidence-based thinking, I wondered if this might actually come into Mr. Hitchens' presentation. To give you an example, if we look at Koenig and Cohen's very famous book, published in 2001, The Link Between Religion and Health, we find that the overwhelming body of empirical studies to look at this find a positive correlation between religious commitment and well-being. Now, that does not prove that there is a God, and certainly it does not prove that all forms of religion are good for you. I will gladly concede, because I think Mr. Hitchens is right on this, that there are some forms of religion that are pathological, that damage people. But there's a need, I think, for a real discussion about what is pathological and what is normal, about what is the center and what are the fringes. And that, I think, also extends to Mr. Hitchens' analysis of the impact of religion in general. He makes the point, and I think I want to say he is right to make this point, that religion has done much damage in history. I regard that point as being beyond contradiction, and it seems to me that every one of us here this afternoon needs to say that is right. But I think we need also to go further and begin to explore. And the kind of questions I would like to open up for discussion would include these. Yes, religion has done damage. But is this typical, or is this a fringe element? Who are the normal people? Who are the fanatics? And it seems to me there's a real need to try and make this kind of adjudication. I grant the history is there, that there have been some awful things done. But as Michael Shermer, who's president of the Skeptic Society, wrote in a book, How We Believe, some years ago, for every one of these atrocities, which must cause all of us deep concern, there are 10,000 unreported acts of kindness, generosity, and so forth arising from religious commitment. And trying to get this balance right seems to me to be of enormous importance. What is the fringe? What is the center? So that's one point I think I'd like to open up for further discussion. But I'd also like to try and just make a more general point, and that is that I think worldviews in general, whether they are religious, irreligious, whatever they are, have the capacity to animate people to the extent that they feel they must go and do things which many of us would regard as morally reprehensible. We see this in the Soviet Union, a rather grim period in modern history, where we find, for example, Lenin having said basically that there is no higher authority by which he may be judged, feeling able to, I quote, authorize the protracted use of brutality against religious believers. And it seems to me that we have here an ideology, a worldview, which basically is sanctioning violence, in this case, anti-religious violence. Now, I would not argue from that this shows that atheism in general, or atheists in particular, are violent people. It's much more about what movements do to people, about the damage that worldviews can cause when they begin to take over and begin to really animate people to want to do things. Again, look at the period under Stalin. There are many other examples we could give of worldviews that may well have begun with great excitement, great enthusiasm, a commitment to ideals that we can all identify with, but something happens and they go wrong. The French Revolution, I believe, began with an outburst of energy for liberty. But by 1793, it degenerated into the reign of terror, in which an appeal to liberty sanctioned the most dreadful acts of violence. And many of you will know the tragic story of Madame Roland, who was brought to the guillotine on trumped-up charges in 1793, and as she was led to the guillotine, she pointed to a statue of liberty in the Place de la Révolution and said, "Liberty, what crimes are committed in your name?" History, I think, discloses a complex judgment here. I do not believe that it simply points to religion as being the cause of evil. I think it points to the capacity of all worldviews to begin to do this. It's not so much religion or indeed anti-religion. It seems to be something actually about human nature itself, which means that acts of kindness can be accompanied by acts of violence. There's something about us, I think, that really needs to be addressed there. So I don't think it's as straightforward as this. Religion poisons everything? I'm not sure. It can do, but so can other things as well. The real problem, I think, is extremism, the kinds of ideologies that force violence upon us. And those, it seems to me, do need to be challenged. And on that, I am at one with Mr. Hitchens. But is it God that's doing this? Well, let's move on and talk about this. Clearly, a very important question here is how we know what God is like. Can you imagine God saying, "Go and do violence to someone"? Well, I think some could quite easily. But I speak from a specific perspective, namely that of a Christian theologian. And for Christianity, the identity, the nature of God is disclosed in Jesus of Nazareth. He is the image of the invisible God. He is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. And when we look at Jesus of Nazareth, we see something I think that is very, very challenging. We have one who refuses to do violence. Even in Gethsemane, when some want to raise swords to defend him as he's about to be betrayed, he bids them put their swords down. Jesus does not do violence, but he has violence done to him. And the point I want to make is that your vision of what God is like has a profound impact on what you think God is urging you to do. And it seems to me that if one is a good Christian, then one is going to take the vision of what God is like and what God wants us to do that we find disclosed in Jesus with the utmost seriousness. Now, let me make it absolutely clear. I concede, and I may well be one of these, that there are many bad Christians around who fail to live up to this vision. But I want to draw a clear distinction between some Christians are bad and Christianity is bad. There is an aspiration, an inspiration, and norm, and that means one can challenge those who want in some way to use violence in the name of God. And of course, you can see this impacting on the way in which people behave in an episode that happened a year ago here in the United States. You've had, unfortunately, in recent days, some shooting incidents, and of